My brother asked me to be his best man, so I spent months planning his wedding and writing a speech. 8 days before the ceremony, he replaced me with his coworker and seated me alone at a random table. My name is Nolan. I'm 32, and I need to tell you about the worst wedding I've ever been to. And that's saying something, because I once attended a ceremony where the groom's ex showed up wearing white and the flower girl bit the officiant. But at least at that wedding, I had a seat at a table where somebody knew who I was. Let me back up a bit. My brother Brody is 3 years younger than me. Growing up, we were actually close. Not in that picture-perfect tossing the football in the backyard kind of way, but close in the ways that actually count. I was the one who taught him to ride a bike. I was the one who sat outside the principal's office with him when he got suspended in 8th grade for telling his history teacher that the Civil War was basically just a really long argument. I was the one who drove 45 minutes at 2 o'clock in the morning to pick him up from a house party when he was 16 because he was too scared to call our parents. We had good parents. I want to be clear about that. Mom and Dad were solid people who kept a roof over our heads and food on the table. They weren't villains. But there was always this unspoken dynamic in our house where Brody was the golden child and I was the bronze child. Not neglected exactly, just slightly less shiny. Like I was the reliable sedan they drove to work every day without thinking about. And Brody was the sports car they kept polished in the driveway and showed off to the neighbors. Brody was the kid who got straight A's without breaking a sweat, who made varsity baseball as a sophomore, who had the kind of easy charisma that made teachers and neighbors and random strangers at the grocery store just gravitate toward him like he had his own gravitational pull. I was more of an acquired taste, quiet, a little awkward, good at math, which as we all know is the personality trait that gets you invited to exactly 0 parties in high school. But it also meant I noticed things. I noticed patterns. I noticed when the numbers didn't add up. That skill was worthless at 16 and absolutely priceless at 32, but I never resented Brody for it. That's the part people don't understand. I loved my brother. I was genuinely proud of him when he graduated from college. I drove 6 hours to be there when he landed his first big promotion at this financial consulting firm downtown. I took him out to dinner and paid for the whole thing. Even though I was barely scraping by at the time, working as a junior data analyst, making just enough to cover rent and ramen. When he told me he was dating this woman named Lillian, I was happy for him. She seemed great, smart, funny, worked in non-profit fundraising, had this laugh that could fill an entire room. They dated for about 2 years before Brody proposed. He called me the night it happened, and I swear his voice was shaking like a kid on Christmas morning. "Nolan," she said. "Yes, man." She said yes. I told him congratulations, and I meant it with everything I had. Then he said the words that, looking back, were the beginning of the end. "I want you to be my best man." There's nobody else I'd even consider. I got a little choked up hearing that. We were 29 and 32 at that point. Life had done what life does. We didn't hang out as much. He had his world, and I had mine. But hearing him say that made me feel like we were kids again. I said yes immediately. Didn't even hesitate. For the next 8 months, I threw myself into best man duties like it was my full-time job. I helped him pick out the venue. This gorgeous converted barn about an hour outside the city with string lights and exposed beams. Spent 3 weekends driving to different locations, comparing prices, and checking acoustics. I organized the bachelor party, which involved renting a cabin near a lake and convincing 8 guys to go kayaking. 2 guys tipped over within the first 10 minutes, but everyone had a great time. And Brody hugged me at the end of the weekend and said, "This was perfect, man. Thank you." And I believed every word of it and the speech. I started working on it in month 2. I know that sounds early, but here's the thing about me. I'm not a natural public speaker. I'm the kind of guy who rehearses his coffee order in his head 3 times before he gets to the register. So, I knew the speech had to be perfect. And the only way that was happening was if I started early and revised it about 47 times. I wrote that thing like it was my college thesis. Went through old photos, called up childhood friends, even reached out to one of Brody's college roommates, this guy named Gavin, for stories from the years I wasn't around. The speech was funny. It was heartfelt. It had a callback to this inside joke about a raccoon that broke into our garage when we were kids, and how 10-year-old Brody tried to fight it off with a broom while standing on a lawn chair screaming like he was in a horror movie. Best thing I'd ever written. Here's where things started to shift. About 3 months before the wedding, Brody started hanging out with this guy named Dawson, coworker at the consulting firm. I'd met him once at a weekend cookout, and my read was that he was the type who called everyone bro and thought being loud was the same thing as being interesting. But Brody liked him, and who was I to judge? I once had a friend in college whose main hobby was ranking gas station bathrooms by cleanliness. So, I wasn't exactly operating from a position of social authority. At first, it was subtle. Brody mentioning Dawson more in conversation. Dawson and I went golfing. Dawson knows this great steakhouse. Dawson thinks the venue should have a cigar bar. That last one annoyed me, because we'd already finalized the venue plan, and I'd spent weeks coordinating with the event manager going back and forth on layouts. But I let it go. That's what I did. I always let it go. Then I started getting fewer texts about wedding stuff. Decisions were being made without me. The seating chart got changed. The playlist got overhauled. Even the groomsmen's ties got switched to a different color. And I found out through the group chat that Dawson had been added to without anyone asking me. I told myself I was overthinking it. Brody was stressed. Weddings are chaotic. Maybe Dawson was just being helpful because he had more free time than I did. I was still the best man. My name was still on the program. That's what mattered. Right then, exactly 8 days before the wedding, Brody called. He didn't ease into it. Didn't soften it up with small talk or ask how my day was. He just said it like he was reading it off a card, which knowing Brody, he probably was. "Hey, Nolan. So, Lillian and I have been talking and we've decided to make some changes to the wedding party. We're going to have Dawson step into the best man role. It's nothing personal. He's just been more involved lately. And Lillian thinks it'll flow better for the ceremony. I didn't say anything for about 10 seconds. I know because I was staring at the microwave clock. Nolan, you there? Yeah, I said I'm here. You're still a groomsman, obviously. Nothing else changes. We just think this makes more sense. I wanted to ask him what part of replacing your own brother makes more sense. I wanted to ask if Dawson had written a speech that referenced the raccoon in the garage. I wanted to ask if Lillian had actually said that, or if he was hiding behind her name because he didn't have the spine to own it himself, but I didn't ask any of that because I'm Nolan, and Nolan doesn't make scenes. Nolan says okay, and hangs up and sits in his apartment staring at a wall for 45 minutes wondering what he did wrong. The week between that phone call and the wedding was one of the longest of my life. I kept replaying the conversation in my head looking for clues. Had I missed something? Had I done something wrong at the bachelor party? Was there a moment where Brody looked at me and thought, this guy isn't up to it? I went through our text history like a detective reviewing case files. Everything seemed normal right up until it wasn't. I called my mom the next day, not to complain, just to see if she knew. She did, and that's what really stung. Oh, sweetie. Brody mentioned it. She said it like he told her he was switching caterers. I think Dawson's just been such a big help with everything. It's nothing against you. Don't make this into a thing, Nolan. It's Brody's wedding. Let him have it the way he wants. And there it was, the family motto. Let Brody have it the way he wants. Let Brody pick the restaurant. Let Brody have the bigger room. Let Brody take credit for the thing you helped him build. Don't make it a thing, Nolan. Don't be difficult. Okay, hold on. I gotta stop here for a second. 8 days before the wedding, after 8 months of venue scouting, bachelor parties, and a speech he'd been perfecting since month 2. And his mom's reaction is, don't make this into a thing. That line tells you everything about how this family works. Nolan's been trained since childhood to just absorb it and keep quiet. But pay attention to what Nolan does here. He doesn't blow up. He doesn't beg. He says okay and hangs up. A lot of guys would have gone off, and then Brody gets to play victim. Nolan gave him nothing to work with. Smart move. All right, the actual wedding is somehow worse. Let's keep going. I showed up to the rehearsal dinner in a suit I'd bought specifically for the occasion. I shook hands. I smiled. I told Lillian she looked beautiful, which she did. I even shook Dawson's hand. When he said, no hard feelings, right, bro? I said, of course not, which is the most heroic lie I've ever told. Brody gave a toast at the dinner, thanked everyone, thanked his parents, thanked Lillian's parents, thanked the bridal party by name. He thanked Dawson specifically. This guy has been my rock through this whole process, he said, raising his glass. Couldn't have done it without you, man. He did not mention me, not once, not even in passing. I was his brother, his former best man, and I had become furniture. I sat there and realized something I'd been avoiding for a long time. This wasn't about the wedding. This was about everything. Every time I'd been quietly shuffled to the side so Brody could have his moment. Every time I'd bitten my tongue. Every time I told myself it didn't matter. It all mattered. It had always mattered. The wedding day arrived, and I showed up because I said I would. Put on my groomsman suit, which was slightly different from the best man suit because of course it was. Drove to the barn venue with my stomach in knots and a speech I'd never give folded up in my inside jacket pocket. I don't know why I brought it. The ceremony was beautiful. I'll give them that. Lillian walked down the aisle and Brody started crying. For about 30 seconds, I forgot I was angry and just felt happy for my little brother. Then the feeling passed, and I went back to standing in line like a very well-dressed mannequin. After the ceremony, we moved to the reception. And this is where it got truly spectacularly insulting. I was not seated with the wedding party. I was not seated with my family. I was not seated anywhere near the front of the room. I was at table 14, far back corner, partially hidden behind a support column right next to the kitchen door. My table mates were Lillian's coworker's boyfriend, an elderly couple who turned out to be the caterer's parents, and a woman named Doris, who had apparently been Lillian's college roommate's mother's neighbor. I'm not making that up. I sat down and stared at my place card. Nolan, not Nolan, brother of the groom. Just Nolan, like I was some random acquaintance they'd added last minute to fill a seat. The reception rolled along the way. Receptions do. Dinner, dancing, toasts. And then came the moment I'd been dreading. Dawson stood up, tapped his glass, and launched into the best man speech. My replacement's best man speech. He told a story about Brody at the office involving a printer jam and a missed deadline. The kind of story that makes you realize the guy has known the groom for about 14 months. He made a joke about marriage being like a group project where you actually like your partner. People laughed politely. Lillian smiled. Brody grinned and clapped Dawson on the shoulder like he just delivered the Gettysburg Address. I sat at table 14 behind the column and listened to a speech that had none of the history, none of the heart, and none of the raccoon in the garage. And I felt something shift inside me. Not dramatically, not loudly, just a quiet crack, like something that had been holding for a long time finally giving way. I looked around the room, at all these people laughing and celebrating my brother, and realized not a single person in that entire venue was thinking about me. Not one. I could have vanished right then and nobody would have noticed until someone counted the gift envelopes. After the speech, my mom came over. I thought maybe she'd seen my face during Dawson's toast and realized this had gone too far. Instead, she said, "Wasn't that a lovely speech? Dawson's such a natural." I said, "Yeah, he's great." She patted my arm and walked away, and that was it. That was the moment I realized nobody in this family was going to wake up one morning and see what they'd been doing to me. If I wanted things to change, I was going to have to be the one to change them. I lasted about another hour, watched the first dance, watched Dawson lead a toast with the groomsmen that nobody came to get me for, watched my dad tell the same story about Brody's baseball days he'd told 100 times, and never once mentioned that I was the one who drove Brody to every practice that year because Dad was working late. Before they cut the cake, I stood up from table 14, put my napkin on my chair, and walked out. I didn't say goodbye to anyone. I didn't cause a scene. I just left. Walked right through the kitchen door since it was right there, past two confused servers carrying dessert trays and out into the parking lot. The air was cool and smelled like pine trees and cut grass. I sat in my car for a while with the engine off, just listening to the muffled bass of the DJ coming through the barn walls. I pulled the speech out of my jacket pocket and read it one more time under the dome light. It was good. It was really good, and nobody was ever going to hear it. I folded it back up, put it in the glove box, drove home, hung up my suit, and sat on my couch in the dark. The next morning at 7:14, my phone buzzed. Text from Brody, 3 words. You left early. I stared at those words for a long time. Then I put my phone down and didn't respond. Wait. I need to stop here. His brother texted him the next morning. 3 words. You left early. Not are you okay, just you left early. Like marking attendance at a meeting. That tells you Brody still had zero idea what he'd done. And can we talk about how Nolan handled the wedding? Most guys would have either made a scene or stayed the whole night pretending everything was fine. Nolan didn't either. He gave it an hour, stood up, and quietly walked out. No drama, just removed himself from a place where he wasn't valued. That takes a different kind of strength. Now, here's where this story goes from sad to inspiring. Let's get into it. The weeks after the wedding were rough. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. I didn't fall apart in some dramatic way. I just kind of dimmed, like someone turned the brightness down on my entire life, by about 40%. I went to work, came home, ate dinner, standing over the kitchen counter because sitting at the table felt like too much commitment to the evening. My apartment felt emptier than usual. Even though nothing had changed in it, the speech was still sitting on my desk folded up exactly the way I'd left it. Sometimes I'd look at it and think about all those hours I spent getting the wording just right and wonder how I could have been so stupid to think any of it mattered. I stopped calling my parents. Not out of spite, at least not consciously. I just didn't have the energy to perform the role of the easygoing son who doesn't let things bother him. I'd been performing that role for 32 years, and my contract had expired. Brody texted a few more times in the 2 weeks after the wedding. Hope you're doing good. Mom says you haven't called. And my personal favorite, Lillian wants to do a family dinner soon. You in? As if everything was fine, as if I hadn't been exiled to the back corner of his own wedding and left before dessert. The sheer obliviousness would have been impressive if it wasn't so painful. I didn't respond to any of them, not because I was playing some strategic game of silence. I genuinely didn't know what to say. About a month after the wedding, my buddy Camille called me. We'd been friends since freshman year of college. She's the kind of person who will tell you your haircut looks terrible and then drive you to the barber herself. She could tell something was wrong immediately. You sound like a deflated balloon, she said. What happened? So, I told her everything. The demotion, the rehearsal dinner, table 14, the speech I never gave, the 3-word text. When I finished, she said, Nolan, I love you, but you have got to stop letting people treat you like a side character in your own life. That hit me harder than anything Brody or my parents had ever said. She showed up that Saturday with Thai food and laid out 2 options. Option 1, keep being the nice guy who absorbs everything until you're 65 and bitter. Option 2, start building a life that doesn't revolve around waiting for your family to notice you. I picked option 2, not because I had some grand movie moment, because option 1 sounded miserable and I was already halfway there. I threw myself into work. Data analyst at a mid-sized consulting firm in Ohio. Sounds boring because it is boring, but I was good at it. Really good. I'd been coasting for years because I'd internalized this idea that I was the background character. The steady but unremarkable one. The guy who shows up on time and never raises his hand for anything bigger because he's been conditioned to believe bigger isn't for him. Camille's words kept echoing. Side character. I didn't want to be a side character anymore. I started volunteering for bigger projects, speaking up in meetings instead of just nodding along, pitching ideas instead of waiting to be asked. It felt uncomfortable at first, like wearing shoes that don't quite fit. But I kept doing it. My manager, Monica, noticed almost immediately. She pulled me into her office and said, Nolan, whatever changed, keep doing it. The Whitfield account analysis was the best work anyone on this team has produced in 2 years. That felt good. Not in a bragging way, in an alright, I'm actually capable of things way, like finding out you've been driving with the parking brake on your whole life, and you finally released it. I started running too. Few miles a few times a week. Hated it at first. My lungs burned. My knees protested. And there was this particularly judgmental squirrel in the park near my apartment that seemed personally offended by my pace. But I kept going. After a while, it became the part of my day I looked forward to most. Just me and the road and my own breathing. By month 3, I'd been promoted to senior analyst. By month 5, Monica recommended me for a team lead position on a major client engagement worth about $1.2 million. They wanted me to run the data strategy. Me, the guy who a few months ago was eating cold leftovers alone in the dark. I also met someone. Her name was Ivy, urban planner I ran into at a coffee shop when we both reached for the last blueberry muffin at the same time. She looked at me with a completely straight face and said, I'll arm wrestle you for it. Dead serious. No smile, just pure competitive energy over a baked good. I let her have it. She bought me a coffee and we talked for 2 hours about city infrastructure, which sounds boring, but she made it sound like the most fascinating thing in the world. Ivy was different from anyone I dated before. She was direct but kind, asked real questions, and actually listened. On our 3rd date, she said, tell me something about yourself that you usually keep hidden. And I told her the wedding story. All of it. She didn't look at me with pity. She looked at me with something closer to recognition, like she understood what it felt like to be the person nobody turns to look at. That must have been incredibly lonely, she said. Yeah, I told her it was. Well, she said, reaching across the table and putting her hand on mine, You're not at table 14 anymore. Okay, pause. I gotta say something about Ivy. You're not at table 14 anymore. She said that on the third date. She didn't try to fix him or give him a pep talk. She just let him know he'd already climbed out. That one sentence probably meant more to Nolan than anything his family said in 32 years. And look at where this guy is now. Senior analyst, team lead on a $1 million project, running every day, dating someone who actually sees him. Went from cold leftovers alone in the dark to rebuilding his entire life. Camille's the real MVP for telling him the truth when he needed it. Now Brody finally calls. Let's see how this goes. 6 months after the wedding, Brody called. I almost didn't pick up. I was on Ivy's couch on a Sunday afternoon, half watching a documentary about bridges that she was genuinely fascinated by, and my phone lit up with his name. I hadn't spoken to him in 6 months, hadn't responded to a single text. The silence between us had grown from awkward to enormous, and I'd made peace with it, or at least I thought I had. Ivy looked at the screen, then at me. You don't have to answer that. I know, I said. And then I answered anyway because apparently 6 months of personal growth still can't fully override 32 years of being the brother who shows up. His voice was different. Smaller, somehow less golden. Hey, I know it's been a while. Yeah, I said. It has. There was a long pause. The kind where you can hear someone gathering the courage to say something they've been rehearsing. He said he needed to talk and asked if we could meet up. Every instinct I developed over the last 6 months told me to say no, but I said yes. Not because I was falling back into old patterns, because I wanted to see if the new version of Nolan could sit across from his brother and not shrink. We met at a diner halfway between our apartments. One of those places with sticky menus and coffee that tasted like it was brewed during the previous administration. Brody was already there in a booth near the window. He looked rough, not sick, just worn, like the shine had dulled. His collar was wrinkled, which for Brody was the equivalent of anyone else showing up in pajamas. I sat down across from him and waited. Didn't feel the silence. That was new. Old Nolan would have immediately started smoothing the awkwardness. New Nolan just sat there and let the discomfort exist. He told me a few things had happened since the wedding. Dawson got fired from the firm about 2 months earlier. Turns out the guy had been inflating his numbers on client reports for close to a year. When it all came out, the company almost lost a major account, and some of Dawson's work had Brody's name attached because they'd been collaborating on the same projects. Brody's boss pulled him aside and basically told him he needed to be more careful about who he associated with. His reputation took a real hit. Then things with Lillian had gotten complicated. She kept telling him he didn't take things seriously enough, that he coasted through everything. I almost laughed at the irony, but held it together. Lillian was using the exact same criticism about Brody that I'd swallowed my entire life. He coasted. He'd always coasted. And people like me had been the engines underneath him, doing the actual work the whole time. While he smiled and collected the credit, I set my coffee cup down and looked my brother in the eye in a way I don't think I ever had before. It wasn't one day, Brody. It was 32 years of one day. Every time I got shuffled to the side so you could have the spotlight. Every time I was told not to make it a thing. Every time I showed up for you and you didn't even notice. The wedding wasn't the problem. The wedding was just when I finally stopped pretending it didn't hurt. I wrote you a speech. I said 6 months of work. Called your college roommate. Dug through old photos. Put my entire heart into it. And you replaced me with a guy who told a printer jam story and called marriage a group project. Then you sat me at a table behind a column with people who didn't know my name. At your wedding, Brody, your brother. He was quiet for a long time. His eyes were wet. I didn't realize he started. That's the problem. I said, you never realize because you've never had to. I told him what I wanted. Understand what you did. Stop treating me like an accessory. Tell mom and dad the truth about why I disappeared. Not some vague, I don't know the truth, he asked. And if I do all that, then we'll see. I put a $10 bill on the table and stood up. He looked up at me and for the first time ever, I saw something in his eyes that wasn't confidence or charm. It was fear. Fear that he might have actually lost something he couldn't get back. Good. Over the next few weeks, I heard from my mom. She called twice. The first time she left a voicemail that was mostly confusion. Brody told us some things and your father and I are very upset. I don't understand why you couldn't have just talked to us. The second time I picked up and we had a real conversation. She got defensive immediately, said I was being dramatic, said Brody didn't mean any harm. I told her calmly, Mom, I need you to hear what I'm saying. Instead of explaining it away, she went quiet for a long time. Then she said, when did you get so direct? When I had to, I said. My dad called separately a few days later, quieter about it, but he said something that caught me off guard. I think your mother and I could have done better by you, Nolan. I don't think we realized how much you were carrying. More than I'd gotten in 3 decades, so I took it. 2 months after the diner, my mom called and asked me to a family dinner. Not a holiday, not a birthday, just a dinner. She said Brody and Lillian would be there. She said she and Dad had been doing a lot of talking. She said, and this is a direct quote, we want to try to do this differently. I went, drove to my parents' house on a Saturday evening with Ivy in the passenger seat. She held my hand the whole drive. Same brickwork, same crooked mailbox Dad had been meaning to fix since high school. Same front porch where I'd spent 1,000 hours reading while Brody played in the yard. Inside the table was set for 6. Mom had made pot roast. Brody and Lillian were already there. Brody stood up when he saw me and just stood there for a second like he didn't know what to do with his hands. Hey, Nolan, he said. Hey, Brody. We got through about 20 minutes of safe small talk before my mom set down her fork and said, I think we should talk about what's been going on. Brody went first. He looked right at me and what came out wasn't polished or rehearsed. It was halting and clumsy and honestly a little painful to watch. He apologized for all of it, not just the wedding. For years of taking me for granted, for never stopping to think about what it cost me to always be the one who showed up. Lillian owned her part in pushing for the change, said she'd been treating the wedding like a production instead of thinking about me as a person. My mom's voice cracked when she admitted they'd made me the easy one because it was convenient. Said louder isn't the same as more important. My dad, a man of famously few words, said I deserved better from them, and he should have told me a long time ago. I looked around the table at all of them. I said, thank you. I mean that. But one dinner doesn't undo 32 years, so we'll see how it goes. Nobody argued, nobody deflected, nobody said, don't make it a thing. That alone was worth the drive. After dinner, Brody and I ended up on the front porch. Just the two of us. The night air was cool, crickets doing their thing. He was quiet for a minute and then he said, I read the speech. I looked at him. What speech? Yours, he said. You left a copy in the groomsman's dressing room. The venue coordinator sent it back to Lillian with some leftover stuff. I found it about a month ago. He pulled out his phone and showed me a photo he'd taken of the folded up pages. My handwriting, my coffee stain in the corner, the raccoon story, the thing about me being scared to call mom and dad from that party. The line about how a best man isn't just a title, it's a promise. He'd actually kept a photo of it on his phone this whole time. I read it and sat in my car for 20 minutes, he said. Just sat there. I told him. Well, at least somebody had a reaction. I was banking on that from the audience. He laughed, not his charming public laugh, the real one that sounds like a hiccup. The one I hadn't heard since we were kids. He asked if I'd read it to him someday. I said, maybe. He nodded and didn't push. That was new. 3 months later, Monica offered me the director position. I accepted. That same week, Camille showed up at my apartment with sparkling cider and a card that said to Nolan, the main character. I put it on my desk at work. Ivy used the exact same words when she toasted me that weekend. Those two have never met, but somehow share a brain. Brody calls every couple of weeks now. Real calls. Last month, he drove 2 hours on a Saturday to help me move a couch. Showed up with a dolly and a bag of breakfast sandwiches and said, where do you want this thing? That's not the old Brody. My dad sends me articles about data analytics he clearly doesn't understand. My mom invited Ivy to her book club. Ivy said my mom asked 3 times if she was eating enough and then made her take home a container of soup. She also said my mom pulled her aside and told her thank you for making my son happy. Mom never said that to my face, but she said it to Ivy and Ivy told me. As for Dawson, got fired from his next job too, selling insurance somewhere in New Jersey. Now, last week I found the speech in my desk drawer. Still wrinkled, still coffee stained. I texted Brody a photo with no caption. He replied one word, someday. I wrote back, someday. Then I closed the drawer, grabbed my keys, and drove to Ivy's place for dinner. She opened the door and said, you look like you're in a good mood. I said, I am. She said, good, because I made pasta, and I need someone to tell me it's amazing, even if it's not. I said, it's amazing. She said, you haven't even tried it yet. I said, doesn't matter. We ate on her balcony. She told me about a zoning proposal at City Hall that finally got approved. I told her about a new client my team landed. Normal Tuesday night stuff. The kind of evening that would have felt impossible a year ago when I was eating cold leftovers alone in the dark. I'm 33 now. I run a department. I'm dating a woman who arm wrestled me for a muffin. My brother calls me on his own without needing a reason. And I've got a speech in my desk drawer that's going to make him ugly cry whenever I decide he's ready to hear.